It takes time to come to a point where you're emotionally ready to give raw food diet a chance.
It's a question. This idea of like, sucking water in the morning and sweet for lunch, acid, subacid for dinner, followed by a big salad, right?
Mm-hmm.
Almost everybody I know is eating high food diet is doing some version of that.
Mm-hmm.
Was this your concept?
Mm-hmm.
Or did somebody really influence you on this?
No, nobody. Nobody. I can tell you the entire timeline of this whole thing. In '78, I first started heading towards raw, increasing my raw, and for the next 7 years, basically resisted any idea of becoming all raw all the time. That was not a direction I wanted to go. Why go there? But I kept being faced with it over and over and over, being faced with it, that obviously if raw foods are best for us, why would I want anything that's not best for me? So in '85, I made the commitment to go all raw. But that still took quite a learning curve to figure out how to go all raw, because I could go all raw for some days and then I'm being driven in other directions like starch. And then I could go all raw for weeks and then I'm being driven in other directions. And somewheres around 1990, 91, I'm getting raw streaks that are going months and seasons at a time. I went 9 months all raw, patting myself on the back, got this licked, and then did this thing where I was starting to go through, I did a workout program for 3 weeks and I was going through 5,000 calories a day, but I'm only eating about 3,000 calories a day. By the end of 3 weeks, man, I was so hungry. I was indiscriminately hungry. I would have eaten anything, and I fell right back into starches again. And finally dawned on me, like, if you don't eat enough fruit, you're going to eat starch. I guarantee it. You don't eat enough fruit, you will be eating starch. Guaranteed. So what had happened was I was on fruit for breakfast. My raw plan started out as fruit for breakfast. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know what I was doing. This way it worked. Fruit for breakfast, starch for lunch, protein for dinner. That was my vegan plan. Fruit for breakfast, vegetables and starch for lunch, vegetables and nuts or seeds for dinner. Separate out, because I understood food combining, so I separated out starch from protein, just had a meal of each with vegetables. Well, there was no way in the world, there was no way I could sustain that for long periods of time. It was too much fat. You invariably end up having fats with the starches. You end up needing salts with the starches. It just kept going downhill from there, and you end up eating less and less fruit for breakfast because you just can't wait till the starch for lunch, and the cook takes over. Cook just takes over. For me, cook takes over. And I don't know if that's my addictive susceptibilities or what it is, but I find for most people, they'll forego the raw in order to have more cooked. So I eventually, I don't know, 82, 83, something like that, said, you know what, fruit for breakfast, fruit for lunch. And then either starch for dinner or nuts for dinner. And I did that for a while. And I could get streaks of raw going. But I couldn't sustain them. I'd eventually just end up binging on starches again.
Could you define what starch is?
Bread, rice, pasta, corn, potatoes, grains, tubers, potatoes, sweet potatoes, oats, rice, wheat, didn't really matter. Any complex carbohydrate is a starch. Starch is a complex form of carbohydrate stored by plants, as opposed to glycogen, which is a complex form of carbohydrate stored by animals. Starch and glycogen are essentially the same thing, just whether it comes from a plant or an animal. In the same way that an enzyme is the same thing as a catalyst. It's just whether it's organic chemistry or inorganic chemistry. They do the same function, just different words. So somewhere around 84, 85, I just go, you know what? It's got to be fruit for breakfast. It's got to be fruit for lunch. It's got to be fruit until it gets dark. Was basically my plan. So I just started doing fruit for breakfast, fruit for lunch. But if I let cooked in that door at dinner, all of a sudden I didn't want breakfast. I was eating so much starch at night You know, eat till you pass out, eat till you're indigestion. It doesn't give you the I'm full cue. It just doesn't give you the I'm full cue. So there's no indicator. You don't know, right? There's no rise in blood sugar because your brain's monitoring for blood sugar. Only because that's our natural food. If starch was our natural food, we'd have an indicator in our brain. We'd have a monitor keeping track of that consumption. But we don't. It doesn't exist for us. It's not what we're designed to eat. In the same way that you can't taste fat. We have no sweet, sour, bitter, salty, umami even, if you want to call that a taste. But none of them are fat. Fat doesn't have a taste. And nor do we have a sensor in our brain to tell us when our blood fat levels have gone up. No way to know when you've had enough fat. Most people don't realize that half their calories come from fat. We got to understand our own physiology enough to respect that it can only tell us what it's designed to tell us based on us eating our natural food. Otherwise, we're doing what's called perverting. So we can pervert our taste buds when our natural inclination is to eat sweet and juicy. We can change it over to coffee and cake. It's still sweet and juicy, right? Milk and cookies is still sweet and juicy. Ice cream and piece of pie, it's sweet and juicy. So we've perverted that over. I don't use the word lightly, but we fool ourselves. So in the second half of the 80s, I just wrestled because I asked, in the first half of the 80s, I knew there were people doing some raw food, certainly no one doing all raw, and no good way to reach out to many of them. But in the later half of the 80s, once I was out of school and attending all sorts of conferences and things, I started meeting the professionals who were espousing raw food. Between 86 and 88, I got to ask all the raw fooders in the world that I knew of, or at least all the raw food leaders in the world that I knew of. What I first asked them was, what diet would you recommend for athletes, cooked or raw? All 5 of them said raw, and all 5 of them said, I have no idea. They said, we've never used raw foods with an athlete. We've only used raw foods to help sick people get well. It's the only thing we've ever done with raw foods. Use raw foods to help sick people get well. They were eating some fruit, but they were still eating goat's milk. They weren't even vegan. They didn't know. I mean, that was a world away from them still. It really was. Even though some of them, like Paul Bragg, was espousing fruit and espousing raw food, and at least theoretically did a year or 2 of raw food. But I don't think coming in from the diet we're coming in from, that learning, I don't think you can learn enough in a year or 2. Maybe today you could, but even Shelton said if you want to learn how to eat really healthfully, give yourself at least 7 years. So you're going to make mistakes. Give yourself time. It takes time. It takes time to come to a point where you're emotionally ready to give raw food diet a chance. Some people get ready quicker, but it takes time. And then you got to learn the mechanics. I mean, there's nobody on a cooked food diet that can look at my plate of bananas for lunch and not go, isn't that too many bananas? You're going to eat 15 bananas for lunch? Good. Well, yeah. I had 1 banana for breakfast today. I've been going full tilt boogie since 6 o'clock this morning. Yeah, I'm going to eat 15 bananas. And an entire pitcher full of smoothie to wash it down and feel just fine.